Hey YouTube, we're going to do a video today on the circular saw. Now I know what you're thinking, how much is there to a circular saw to do a video on? Well, I think there's more to it than you might know. I'm going to go over a number of assists that I used or jigs that I used with my circular saw, and I'm going to go over a modification I made to my circular saw, and I'm going to go over just some practical information I think that would be a help to most of us, if not all of us. So you stick right with me and I'll get started. Okay, without any more delay, let's get right into using some of these assists. Probably the most popular is the speed square. Now this makes a great guide for making quick, accurate square cutoffs. Maybe you're doing a deck or something with a little more finished work and you need it to be a little more exact, or perhaps you're just a little bit new with a circular saw, you have trouble cutting a straight line. In this case, you'll pull your measurement, put yourself a mark, put your line in there, and then you take your speed square, just line your saw notch right up to that mark, slide your speed square on the far side of the wood, and just let it go. Now that will give you a very accurate cut, just comparable to a miter box. And it's also very quick. It's good for 2x4s, 2x6s, so that works great for that. Let's move on to another one. Some years ago I was doing a lot of countertops, cutting all that board down, and you always want to try to use your factory edges for, of course, a finished end. And you can never really come up with enough factory edges. There's only 2 per run, so what I did was I came up with this cutoff, which is basically the same idea as the speed square, but only bigger, because I was cutting down a lot of these boards were 25 inches wide. This worked fantastic. I still use it occasionally, but I'm not building that many countertops, but a lot of times I'll have half of a sheet to cut down and I want to have a perfect cut on it. It's too long to go on the table saw, so let me show you how this works. These usually work best on the ground. You don't have to clamp it. Just your weight will hold it in place. So you put your mark wherever you want to cut off, and then you slide this, put your saw on there just like the speed square, and you just put your weight on it and you just run your saw right through there. It works beautiful. Every time you have a factory that gives you a beautiful cut, you're ready to go. Factory, every time. You can cut off even the smallest amount, just a little tiny 1/8 of an inch. I made this out of 1/2 inch cabinet plywood. Very simple. This is a new one I've been using. In fact, I just made this. This is to cross-cut a sheet of plywood in the shop. Maybe the sheet's just too big to get on your table saw safely. So I came up with this one here, and what this does is, now we've all used straight edges and clamped a 4-foot level or whatever and use that as a guide. The problem with that is you have to put your mark and then you have to move your straight edge back off of that line as wide as the shoe on your circular saw is. That gets a little tiresome going back and forth getting that measurement exactly right. With this one here, you line this edge right up here to your cut mark, clamp it down, and you're ready to go. The next one, which is probably the most underused accessory you can get with a circular saw. These cost about 8 or 10 bucks. They're a rip guide, and I bought one of these years and years and years ago, and I can tell you I've used this thing more than any other jig with my circular saw. So if you don't have one of these, you really should pick one up because they're very useful. You can rip down long sheets up to a, you know, they'll only cut so wide, but you can cut down some perfect rips, especially if you're going to cut down a succession of rips where each one tends to get a little bit off. So let me show you how beautifully this thing works. Now that thing just sits in your saw. You can put it in from either side to get an even wider cut if you need to. But these things work very good. Sometimes you got to add a little piece of wood or something because when you get right to the very end and the guide runs off, you know, you can get a little bit tipsy right at the very end. But I've used this thing a ton. In fact, I used it some this week to cut down some finished end panels out on the job. Works great. So pick you up one of these things. Now anybody who's had some experience with a circular saw knows that sometimes the guard will get in your way. Especially when you're cutting on a bevel. When you move that saw over and you're trying to cut a bevel, that guard will get hung up. Now most people will take their guard up and put a wedge in here. And I've done that for years and years. It'll hold that guard out of your way. Now, this way, you're more easily to control the saw and hold the piece of wood. Without that, you're trying to hold the guard, your legs up on the 2x4 and you're trying to cut. It's just kind of unwieldy. Now, I'm going to show you a modification I made to my saw, but I don't want to hear from the YouTube safety sallies telling me it's dangerous. I know it's dangerous. In fact, everything you do with power tools can be dangerous. You try to do what you can as safely as you can. So I've made a modification with my saw. Let me show you up close here. That would allow that guard to be held up by that latch. Now, anytime you circumvent a guard, yeah, it's going to be dangerous. So you've got to develop good safety practices and habits. One of mine is, after I make the cut, I take the latch off and I let the guard go back in place. Every time. You got to have safety habits. So let me show you how nicely that will work. Say with the speed square to cut a 45. Now that made a perfect cut. A lot of times you try to do that freehand, it just doesn't come out that good. And when you're doing like decks or something that's really people are going to see and notice, you want to do that. I've done boxing where you're cutting 1x8s down and you got to cut them if it's a mitered corner. This is great for that because you end up trying to steer your saw through there and hold the guard and so forth. So this works really good for that. But again, you got to use common sense whenever you circumvent a guard or do something, that makes something a little less safety or safely. So use common sense on that. If anybody wants more details on how I did that, just let me know. Maybe I'll do a video on it. It doesn't seem like it's that complicated though. You can see it's a latch with a sheet metal screw. Okay, this last segment, this goes into the tip department. Some people aren't aware, but the shoe of your circular saw blades is a lot of time set up from the factory 1.5 inches from the blade. Now a lot of times when you're cutting framing material, you need to cut out, notch out 1.5 inches, or maybe rip down some bond timber. Well, you don't need to really measure because you just line the side of this shoe up and that gives you 1.5 inches. Now I'll give you an example. let's say we were framing up, we were studding up a gable end wall, and we wanted our studs to tuck right underneath that rafter. So let's say we were doing, this is a 12-12 pitch to make it easy. We got our height to the rafter marked. We put that mark right there. We have our blade set at 1.5 inches deep. So we're going to make our first cut. Then, without measuring anything, we can proceed right on to our second cut. So that gives us a nice stud to tuck right underneath that rafter. You see? Just like that. So that about wraps it up for this circular saw video. I hope you've got something out of it. If you have any tips, any ideas you want to pass along, hey, post away. I'd love to hear about it. I'd love to learn. I'll see you on the next video.